So I'll invite our next round of panelists to turn on their cameras. With this, we're going to be exploring some cross-agency collaboration lessons from the states and hearing from three different pairs of state energy office and DOTs to talk about EV policy and program design insights, particularly within this context of the looming infrastructure bill. And with that, I will turn over to Robert Jackson from the Michigan Energy Office to get us started and to introduce our panelists. Robert.
Oh, thank you, Cassie. I hope everyone can hear me well.
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. So I want to thank NASEO and the conference presenters really for organizing this session and for the conference in general. I think it's very important to have this conversation now, given the amount of investment that we're going to be doing in the future in building out our EV infrastructure across the U.S. And this panel, we're going to talk about the importance of EV infrastructure planning as well as coordination between state agencies in the build out, as well as coordination with the public-private sector. But before we start to get into the panelists, I want to talk a little bit about what Michigan's doing. In Michigan, it really starts at the top with Governor Whitmer and her work and her belief that climate issues are important to all, and directing the state to develop a Michigan Healthy Climate Plan, which really lays out a strategy for Michigan to reach carbon neutrality by 2050. To do this, the governor established a Council on Climate Solutions, which is going to develop recommendations in both the building, housing sector, industry, forest production, power generation, waste, and transportation and mobility to achieve carbon neutrality and to address diversity and equity and inclusion, again, by 2050. From the Energy Office perspective, we're supporting this work through actively participating in the work group and aligning programs that supports the council's work through state energy programs and our investment in just energy transition planning, which is really in 5 pillars. And those pillars are really our callous communities, where we're working to help communities on their path towards carbon neutrality, moving industry towards a low carbon future. And that work really involves reducing their scope 1 through 3 GHG emissions from energy intensive industries. And then the third pillar is clean energy for all, which is basically energy equity, providing all Michiganders access to clean, reliable energy. And the fourth is paying it forward. That's really building an inclusive workforce, providing everyone with an opportunity to have access to a clean job. And the fifth pillar, which is really tied to what we're talking about today, and that's just and equitable transportation. And we're doing that in coordination with our environmental protection group, our environment, energy, Great Lakes department, which houses the Energy Office, our Public Service Commission, the Office of Future Mobility and Electrification, our Department of Transportation, Department of Labor and Economic Growth, and our Michigan Economic Development Corporation. Now, Michigan is kind of unique in other states is that, and I think we were the first state that really, when we were planning our EV infrastructure, we did this through a modeling and consultation with the auto industry, EV charging companies, utilities, and all interested parties. And we developed a model, based upon mathematics and based upon data that we received from these groups, to build up the placement of DC fast charging stations along Michigan highway corridors, and the charging placement of along these corridors using what we call the 1/3 model. So we actually, in our plan, which calls for the initial plan, which calls for 300 charging stations and a little bit over 4,000 chargers, it does look at the 1/3 funding model, where we're looking at paying for the infrastructure build out through a combination of sources, through state money, through private sector money, and through utility donations, utility contributions to the building of the network. But as we're building out this network, now we're beginning to look at, okay, how do we create these stretch goals, the things that we can do, given now that we have American Rescue Plan money and then the infrastructure funds that are coming out. And so we started working on, through our Office of Future Mobility and Electrification, a state strategy for future mobility and vehicle electrification, which looks at future-proofing and growing our auto industry and its workforce, builds safer, smarter, greener transportation infrastructure, and really lead the world in mobility and innovation and policy. And these are things that we have in motion, and we're doing it, at a state level in the collaboration with the other agencies. But we're also partnering with neighboring states and with the Canadian province of Ontario, really to build this infrastructure. We're looking at having connected infrastructure that will allow someone in Wisconsin to drive through Michigan on their way to Buffalo, New York, through Ontario. And we're also doing this through an equity lens where we know that in building out this transportation, this EV transportation infrastructure, it has to be inclusive. It has to include everyone. So we are making investments in heavy-duty vehicles, encouraging the flipping of fleets, private fleets, and community fleets to electric vehicles, building a heavy-duty EV charging infrastructure, and then we're also looking at wireless charging to see where is it relevant, where can we place it, and along with that, we're looking at in this modeling that we're coming up in terms of ensuring that we have adequate charging in remote areas of the state, how can we do so in terms of siting and coupling DC fast charging with solar and battery storage. So those are just a few things of what Michigan's doing. And our panel that we have today, I know that they can tell us about a great number of things that they're doing within their state. So I'd like to start off by introducing Tanya Buell. She's the Project Development Manager in Innovation Partnerships, Washington State Department of Transportation, and Michael Brish, Senior Energy Policy Specialist for the Energy Division of Washington State Department of Transportation. Tanya, Michael.
The buzzing sound is gone. Yay. Well, thank you so much for having us part of this panel. We are thrilled to be here. I am very thankful to Cassie Powers for organizing this session. I think one of the most important things for a successful ZEV, zero-emission vehicle deployment and planning is to have a strong cross-agency team working closely with our sister agencies to make sure we are synergizing our funding and efforts. And so I'm excited to be talking with you today. My colleague, Michael Brish from the Commerce Energy Office is a pleasure to work with. He's very smart and savvy, and his background coming from electric utilities and expertise has been really helpful as we work together on several projects. So we're going to be going back and forth. I'm with the Department of Transportation. Michael's representing Department of Commerce, and we also work with several other partners such as the Department of Ecology. We have a very strong interagency working group in Washington, and I think that's why a lot of our programs have been so successful. So I believe Michael is next up on the first content slide. There we go.
Hi, everyone. I'm Michael Brish. I use he, him pronouns. I want to echo the thanks to Cassie, Dylan, and the rest of the NASEO team. And I just also want to very quickly acknowledge that it's just an utter delight to work with Tonya. I call her the queen of EVs in the Northwest, and there's many reasons for that. And if you've had the pleasure to work with her, you know why. And it speaks to the relationship we built. So I know we have only a handful of minutes to go through. So the reason we threw this slide up here is to really underscore the transformation in clean transportation that is happening, at least legislatively, from a state perspective in Washington. Not enough time to go through these bills, but this really underscores some major, like a LCFS, a cap and invest program, or major budgets that underscore the work that Tony and I and our sister agencies, or rather sibling agencies, have ahead of us. Next slide.
Okay, so today we're going to talk about where we started, where we are and where we're going around zero emission vehicle planning and policy and deployment. And I think I got that title of Queen Webb from being the one that's been around the longest since the conception of the West Coast Electric Highway. And so I've been working in the space for a long time. And ever since my first week working on alternative fuels, I've been included in a committee that our governor's office organized, where it was just a handful of us sitting around a table and planning out some of the important policy in this area. And we have been working very closely with the Commerce Energy Office. Back in 2011, we co-chaired a state plug-in electric vehicle task force with several members from all different organizations, from utilities to local government, and those interested in electric vehicle planning. Work very closely with our clean cities as well, to really work together. I think in the early days, we basically had a big map of our state and we're sticking push pins in it. And that was our planning, but we've gotten better and better. I mentioned the West Coast Electric Highway, and it was actually our sister agency, Department of Commerce, that had some Recovery Act ARA funding. And they were able to provide us some funding to get our vision started for having electric vehicle charging along our major highway corridors every 50 miles or so. And actually, Oregon DOT led a similar project in Oregon with funding from their state energy program through their Department of Energy. So not only do we coordinate between our state agencies within the state, but we also coordinate with departments of transportation and state energy offices and departments of environment and ecology in all of the West Coast states. We actually have regular monthly meetings with British Columbia, Washington, Oregon, and California to make sure we're in line on standards and signage and things that will provide EV drivers with a unique driving experience, whether they're crossing state lines or just to know what to expect. And the Department of Commerce also has a really active AFTAG group, mostly fleet managers from different state agencies that meet on a regular basis to talk about the latest and greatest in ZEV information. Okay, so I'm gonna just keep moving along. If you go to the next slide. These are some of the plans that we've done, including a plan to help, a guidebook to help local governments with their ZEV planning. We did a state plan back in the early days, and then we had a goal of 50,000 electric vehicles on our roads by 2020. So we put together an action plan, mostly legislative policy decisions that would help us move into that area. And so now I'm going to hand it back over to Michael Breach on the next slide.
Thanks, Tonya. So Tony just went through where we've been, and I'm going to quickly cover where we are. So next slide. So about 16 months ago, legislative staff approached Tonya, me, and some other agency folks, namely ecology, about a complex set of funding options and policies that they were thinking about and how those would land in certain state agencies. So this slide represents a diagram that Tonya and I and some others worked on the right, which shows the various attendant public policy outcomes that can come from charging station. So the movement of goods and people in the upper left, air quality upper right, electric grid considerations lower left, and then economic development. Certainly there's more, but this is how we bucketed it. And each agency has responsibilities there, as well as you can see in the middle, environmental justice, equity outcomes that cover all aspects of those four policy areas. And so on the left is kind of just a list of agencies that are involved, from our administrative agency to the ones that Tonya's mentioned to our Department of Ag. Next slide. this is and represents an effort that it's really, there's a lot going on. Tonya, in her diligence and brilliance, created just this chart that tracks, and this is a snippet on the right, but really allowed us to show key policymakers and decision makers within our and without our agencies the complexity, the overlapping nature, and then a lot of the funding, both federal, state, that we have to track. And so some of the questions that previous diagram in this chart allowed us to ask is what agencies need to be involved? Do we need to coordinate more or less? What are some informal or formal structures that we need? So we coordinate really in an informal manner, and we're getting to some really large sums of money in major policy that might require more formal structures. And finally, what are we leveraging from our federal agencies, both like our relationships and the statutory authority or requirements that come with money, and then of course the local governments as well. And we really needed to convey this really complexity to decision makers that really don't understand the overlapping nature. So it's been a very big educational effort. Next slide. So I'm going to really cruise through some of the background really quick. So right now, as a and this is a couple months out of date, we're around 80,000 or so EVs. This is through our data collected from our Department of Licensing. So next slide. And this slide that you're about to see is credit to Atlas Public Policy. This is a visual of the charging infrastructure that they're tracking in our state. So note the port numbers in the upper right. So next slide. And so this is where Tony and I and our other colleagues are faced, which is we have about 80,000 EVs in those port numbers, not tracking private level ports, and based on state law around greenhouse gas emission reduction targets, as well as some transportation goals, how do we get to, with approximately 8 million EVs, probably more about that time, how are we going to figure out where our charging infrastructure goes, which I know many states are asking. And so I think the next slide is, Tony will start answering that question.
Thank you, Michael. So there's been a lot of excellent policy in Washington state. And one of the things that came out of our last legislative session was direction for WashDOT to work closely with our sister agencies on developing a zero-emission vehicle mapping and forecasting tool. And this bill, House Bill 1287, includes 3 major parts. So the first one is the ZEV mapping and forecasting tool, which will help us with statewide zero-emission vehicle infrastructure planning, help us with our utilities and several of our stakeholders, provide the information they need to make decisions. And then the second part is working with the utilities so they can do planning in their local territories. And then the third is a state building code effort. Next slide, please. So this ZEV planning tool is something that we are scoping out right now. We're actually working with a couple of our universities to help us with identifying different tools and software platforms that we might be able to use. Basically, we are developing a tool that is going to provide information on where we are today as far as ZEV infrastructure, where we need to be to meet our greenhouse gas emission goals, and where we forecast down to at least the zip code level, so local communities can do planning around where they might need to put in zero emission vehicle infrastructure. And so it's going to require a lot of coordination to make sure we're collecting the right information and providing our stakeholders with the information they need. So this is a big effort that's just getting underway, and we're really excited about it because this will help us with data-driven analysis that we need. Next slide. Thank you so much for listening to Washington State, and we are pleased to be here and pleased that there's a realization that coordination is critical to the success of of these programs, especially with different funding going to different agencies. We all need to really coordinate to maximize the use of that. Thank you.
Thank you. So our next set of speakers are Michael King, the Assistant Director of Electrification and Energy at Colorado Department of Transportation, and Christian Willis, Senior Director of Transportation, Fuels, and Technology, Colorado Energy Office.
All right, thanks, Robert. Again, my name is Christian Willis. I'm the Senior Director for Transportation, Fuels, and Technology, and I'll start our conversation from Colorado. And so like Washington, we're going to start out by talking about where we started. We'll then talk about how our relationship really evolved over the last handful of years and what that's meant for the way that we develop and implement programs in Colorado. And so I think we heard in the first panel about the importance of strong working relationships between DOTs and energy offices. And we're really fortunate in Colorado that we have a strong relationship between the Colorado Energy Office and the Colorado Department of Transportation, and that we're really well aligned both at the staff level as well as at our leadership levels, with frequently decisions being made by consensus. But it really goes beyond just our two agencies. We work very closely with the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment, which is where our air agency is, as well as the Regional Air Quality Council located in the metro area. And we, as our four agencies, we really work very closely to deliver on Colorado's programming, our policy, and our regulatory strategy. But it hasn't really always been this way. The relationship has evolved pretty dramatically over the years, from one in which CDOT was primarily a funder of programs that were administered by the Energy Office and the Regional Air Quality Council, or the RAC, to one where we've worked in close collaboration, but still generally worked independently as agencies, to where we find ourselves today, which is that really close partnership where we're working on a variety of statewide strategies. And so I'll provide just a couple of examples, starting with that funding relationship, and then I'll turn it over to my colleague, Mike King from Department of Transportation. And so in 2013, CDOT, CO, and the Regional Air Quality Council launched a program called Alt Fuels Colorado. This CDOT provided $15 million to each of our agencies to develop programming to incentivize purchase of alternative fuel, medium and heavy duty vehicles, primarily compressed natural gas, as well as installation of publicly accessible CNG stations. CDOT issued contracts or interagency agreements to each of our agencies and really held us accountable through regular reporting as well as periodic check-ins. And through this program, we saw really quick success in terms of the number of vehicles that were purchased and the number of stations installed. But we did find that over time, interest in Colorado for CNG and propane really waned among fleets, and interest in electrification grew. And so in 2018, we requested and received permission from CDOT to reallocate the remaining funding away from CNG and toward building out high-speed charging stations along Colorado's major transportation corridors. And so this resulted in our DC fast charging program. I think many on the call are familiar with this program. It's one that's ongoing, and we've at this point installed stations at half of the 34 locations across our interstates and highways. And from ChargePoint actually referenced this program in her comments when she talked about the station and the picture behind her. That's from Wellington, Colorado, which is along the Northern Front Range. And this program actually led to a more recent offering, which is focused on installing high-speed charging in plazas in our metropolitan areas around the state. Sarah from EVgo mentioned this in her comments. We've run a couple of funding rounds now. We've made awards for dozens of stations around the metro area, and we're preparing for another funding round next month. One other thing I'd note about this kind of period of our relationship is that our agencies started serving as reviewers, technical reviewers on the different program offerings for each of the agencies. So really got to develop a pretty strong understanding of the organizational strengths from each agency, as well as their programs and their priorities. And so this really resulted in an easy transition from just that funding relationship to one that we collaborated closely when the VW settlement was announced. And so like most states, our air agency was the lead agency, but they relied pretty heavily on CO and CDOT and Regional Air Quality Council in developing our beneficiary mitigation plan. And because of the work that we had done previously setting up programs, we were able to really leverage the existing programs, including that Alt Fuels Colorado program I mentioned, to deploy those VW funds more quickly. One thing that I would mention maybe before I hand it over to Mike, and that's that, as we've developed these programs, we've really sought to inject a high degree of flexibility into the programs. This has allowed us to integrate a variety of funding sources, regardless of whether they've got different constraints or different limitations. We've been really flexible with funding sources. It's also allowed us to respond to changes in the market, sometimes really significant changes to our program, for instance, going from CNG to electrification. We were able to do that without having to start from scratch. And so there's no question in my mind that these programs are really going to be central to any federal funding that comes as a result of infrastructure package. I'm sure we'll have to develop different programs that these I think will really serve as the core of that funding. So with that, I'll turn it over to my colleague, Mike King.
Thank you, Christian. As Christian alluded to, our relationship between our two agencies and our other two partner agencies has really evolved over time. I think it's fair at this point to characterize it as a really close partnership, as opposed to just a funder or a collaborator, similar to what we've heard from Washington as well. One of the things that characterizes this is just the level of daily and weekly coordination between us at both a staff level, but also at the executive level of our agencies. A lot of decisions at this point are really made by consensus as a group, as opposed to the individual agency holding the purse strings for a certain program, making decisions and then consulting with others. It's really more of a collaboration. We've seen this also. Apart from the infrastructure side of things, we've seen this in terms of regulations in the state. So as the ZEV program rulemaking and the current clean trucking strategy that we're developing, all being at the table, all speaking with one voice to the public. And I think also importantly, sometimes building trust with our own stakeholders, with those other agencies that they might not deal with as regularly. So vouching for the quality and the approach of our sister agencies as we talk with our stakeholders that know us best. Another example from an infrastructure perspective more recently is we've developed a new electrified byways and tourism funding program, really focused on scenic byways, rural tourist destinations. And this is an example where CDOT's existing relationship with the Scenic Byways Commission, our mapping and travel data that we bring to the table. We were able to partner that with the Energy Office, their familiarity with the electric utilities across the state. And we also brought in the Colorado Tourism Office, which can really make a pitch in terms of the economic development benefits and help promote these electrified byways to visitors inside and outside of the state. So that's another example of once there's a close partnership between two or more state agencies, you can expand that beyond to others like tourism, agriculture, natural resources, etc. And I would say that this coordination occurs at a program level. It also occurs within individual projects as we reach out to our partner agencies to tap into their unique skills or tools that they might have, such as mapping, modeling, financial modeling, things like that. And most recently, this approach has been somewhat validated by the passage of Senate Bill 260 in our state, which will allocate over the next 10 years about $750 million for electrification projects. The structure of that bill mirrors in some ways the structure of our programs with electrification infrastructure under the Energy Office, the transit investments through CDOT, and the clean fleet investments through our partners at CDPHE, Public Health and Environment. So we feel that we've built this over time. It's become closer and more efficient over time. And it has, as Christian said, allowed us to adapt to different funding sources, different market conditions, and keep leveraging our impact more broadly while expanding into new state agencies and growing the group of folks at the state of Colorado who are interested and engaged in this topic. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Christian. Thank you, Michael. Our next speakers are Alexa Voltek, Energy Program Administrator, Tennessee Department of Environment and Conservation's Office of Energy Programs, and Brianna Benson, Supervisor, Air Quality Office, Tennessee Department of Transportation. Alexa?
Thanks, Robert. And I can kick us off and get us started from Tennessee's perspective. I'll give, similarly to the other states, kind of the background and the context behind the State Energy Office and the DOT's collaborative work together to lead us to kind of where we are today. And I'll hand it off to Brianna Benson then to set us off from there. So to kind of set the stage for Tennessee, I'll first emphasize that I would say in the past 5 or so years, our State Energy Office has significantly expanded our programming and our prioritization of what we call our energy and transportation suite of projects. And this is in part due to the fact that, the transportation sector is now our largest end-use energy consuming sector in the state, as well as our largest source of GHG emissions from fossil fuel consumption, but also because the State Energy Office has taken on the responsibility of managing a few different funding sources, such as the VW Settlement, Environmental Mitigation Trust allocation, as well as our state's EPA Diesel Emission Reduction Act program allocation. And so we've been funding projects and programs in recent years that target vehicle replacements and repowering, as well as infrastructure development. Certain key activities have really catalyzed some of our closer engagement with our state DOT, TDOT, early on, namely the effort to compile the nominations for alternative fuel corridor designations to the Federal Highway Administration. So through a series of 5 rounds, we've supported TDOT closely in compiling and submitting those, and have been able to successfully designate all of our major interstates at this point, as well as a couple of U.S. highways as alternative fuel corridors in Tennessee. And so those designations are critical to us because they then unlock the potential use of certain FHWA funds to support implementation of related fueling infrastructure on those corridors. We also, on the corridor front, applied for and received an FHWA planning grant, which targeted, it was a multi-state project with North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas, and it targeted the I-40 east to west corridor that runs through all 3 of those states. And so this multi-state effort, we were enabled to convene for the first time ever a group of DOT, State Energy Office, and Clean Cities practitioners to really identify the existing infrastructure for both CNG and EV infrastructure, as well as kind of drilling down into those key infrastructure gaps as we look to fill those. Another primary collaborative activity that I want to touch on between TDEC and TDOT that's really framed kind of some of our work today has been the multi-stakeholder effort of Drive Electric Tennessee, which is comprised of not just TDEC and TDOT, but other local government stakeholders, utility players, OEMs, nonprofits, universities, you name it. And so through the Drive Electric Tennessee initiative, in 2018, we did kind of a large stakeholder engagement to develop our shared vision and guiding principles for transportation electrification in Tennessee. We published a roadmap in January 2019, which identified 50 or so projects and initiatives that we could be working on to try and drive our light-duty vehicle adoption to 200,000 vehicles by 2028. We currently have about 13,000 on the road. And then in the fall of 2019, we did what we called a statewide electric vehicle infrastructure needs assessment. And so that was an engagement that identified, the variety of use cases for charging infrastructure, where those infrastructure investments should be placed, and where the private sector was more likely or less likely to develop or invest in charging infrastructure. And so where was the need for public investment? And so following that statewide needs assessment, we started to think through, what funding sources can we be leveraging and partnering with to build some of this out. And so the State Energy Office began to have some preliminary conversations with the Tennessee Valley Authority, which is our primary generation and transmission utility in the state, to develop a jointly funded corridor network, which was identified as a good opportunity for that public funding in the statewide infrastructure needs assessment. And then very much inspired by the work that the Colorado folks just shared and what Colorado is doing, the State Energy Office submitted a proposal to TDOT in February of 2020, essentially requesting approximately $7 million in CMAQ funds to add to the VW funds that the State Energy Office could bring to the table, and then additional funding that TVA could bring to the table. Following the release of FHWA's FY20 apportionment memo, which essentially expanded the use of the Highway Infrastructure Program funds for eligible EV charging infrastructure on alt-fuel corridors, TDOT then determined that they wanted to use that funding source rather than the CMAQ, but they then issued a letter of commitment to bring that funding to the table. So it was exciting for us in February of this year to announce what we're now calling the Fast Charge TN network. And I think there might be a slide with an image of the map for that. And so essentially this partnership between the State Energy Office, TVA, and TDOT, we're collaborating to leverage these multiple funding sources to reduce the barriers to transportation electrification by establishing fast charging stations every 50 miles on not just the primary interstates, but also these secondary roadways that we've highlighted. And so in scope in total, it will be about 50 locations with 2 to 4 chargers at each location that we'll be building out. And so we'll be leveraging those 3 different funding sources to build that off. So before I hand it off to Brianna to touch on where we are today and some of the key issues that we're stepping through, I would say that this statewide corridor network is really indicative of the partnership between those three partners. And it was nice to hear Michael Barabee kind of emphasizing that this type of a partnership is really needed, particularly with some of the anticipated federal funding coming our way. I think for the Fast Charge TN network, we've spent many months working hand in hand to design our programming such that we have a common denominator and a consistency across funding sources, such that if a grantee is funded by VW or by the Tennessee Valley Authority or by TDOT, the program would essentially look the same. And so we've worked with TVA to issue a release or a request for information to vendors of hardware, network, and support services. And that then informed our program-wide minimum technical specifications that we're using to fund chargers across this network. And so I'll pause there and I'll pass it off to Brianna.
Thank you, Alexa. Hi, my name is Brianna Benson, and I work with the Tennessee Department of Transportation and the Air Quality Planning Office. And I just want to say thanks to our partners at AASHTO and NASEO for bringing this collaborative effort together today. It's been really great information from numerous stakeholders. But today I'm going to share with you where the state of Tennessee is at. Alexa, thank you for providing that background information. So really, since we received that proposal from the Tennessee Department of Environment and Conservation requesting some funding support for electric vehicle infrastructure in the state of Tennessee, that kind of helped us further launch our collaboration between the 2 departments to really focus on electric vehicle charging infrastructure in particular. So what that partnership has really looked like is over the past almost a year, we have participated in weekly check-in meetings with TDEC, Alexa's group and my group at TDOT to just make sure that we're kind of in lockstep as we generate what the Tennessee Fast Charge Network is going to look like, knowing we have a few different funding sources, some with federal red tape tied and the Volkswagen Settlement money having a little less red tape. We wanted to make sure that either way that these chargers can meet kind of a full network and put together that technical specification. Additionally to that, since December of 2020, stakeholders from TDOT, TDEC, and the Tennessee Valley Authority have participated in a highway infrastructure program working group where we're focusing on bringing together key stakeholders to really start developing how to best utilize this money. We've done some research also nationwide to try to figure out who else is trying to utilize this money and figuring out all the pieces of regulations that need to be met in order to meet compliance. So we have engaged our partners at the Federal Highways Tennessee Division. They participate in that monthly group. We have also engaged various partners throughout TDOT to make sure we're handling this money properly. So we have stakeholders from legal, finance, our right-of-way division office, local programs offices, roadway design, NEPA, utilities, construction, and then the air quality planning office is housed within long-range planning. So we do our best to engage all stakeholders at the DOT as much as possible to make this a collaborative effort so we can see the chargers actually be installed with this HIP money. One thing we are really proud of is we've worked collaboratively within that working group and some subcommittees to develop some ADA guidelines for charging sites. Right now, there is not any federal guidance on developing any ADA compliance for electric vehicle infrastructure. However, we have coordinated to define accessibility parameters for our Fast Charge Tennessee network. Should any ADA compliance guidelines come out specific for EV chargers, we will be sure to follow those as well. But we noticed that California DOT, Caltrans, was developing something similar, and we wanted to ensure that we're considering that for our Tennessee population and any tourists that may travel through the state of Tennessee. So I will note that although we are still in the efforts of identifying the best path forward for utilizing the federal funding, we have identified some major sticking points, and some of that was discussed in that earlier session today by our DOE and DOT partners. So how to utilize the right-of-way guidance memo, should we define EV chargers as a utility or permitted use? We're still exploring that. Also, Buy America continues to be a huge hurdle in Tennessee. And then lastly, we are also just anxiously waiting the infrastructure bill and planning as much as we can in advance for any future funding and capacity needs that may be needed to address from what comes out of that infrastructure bill. One thing I want to add, just at the tail end, Alexa mentioned the I-40 deployment plan that we received at Tennessee Department of Transportation. Since then, we have also created an I-40 implementation plan, and we really just want to build on what the I-40 deployment plan started. So we are planning this for informing TDOT's role in the Fast Charge Tennessee network. We want to further outline how TDOT can sustain our efforts in alternative fuels infrastructure and beyond what we've received for that highway infrastructure allotment. Just, we know CMAQ money can be used for EV charger as well. So part of those components will include a literature review, including best practices from other states who have successfully implemented EVs with public sector funds. Also identifying the roles within Tennessee, like who are all the stakeholders who need to be at the table for this conversation outside of the Environment Conservation Group at TDEC, TDOT, our Clean Cities Coalition partners. We also want to do a site analysis and infrastructure gap prioritization and develop a comprehensive implementation strategy so that we can have sustainable funding as well. One thing I'll just note about Tennessee, we know that we're kind of in a hot seat right now with Tennessee being an emerging electric vehicle leader. We are ranked #1 in the Southeast for EV manufacturing. We have the Nissan plant. We also have a Volkswagen plant and a GM plant in the state of Tennessee. So we are seeing some new vehicles being released this year. The Nissan Leaf, the Volkswagen ID4, and the Cadillac Lyriq are all slated for production in the next 24 months. So knowing we generate a lot of vehicles in the state of Tennessee, we want to be well prepared for people to utilize those electric vehicles. So, all I'll say for now about what we're currently doing, I'm going to hand it over to Alexa to talk about looking forward. Thank you.
Well, I don't know, we probably just have a few minutes, Robert, so I wonder if we should pass it off to Q&A.
Okay, thank you. So we just have a few minutes left, and I'm going to try to be selective in the questions I ask. But there's one question I think applies to everyone. You know, as in Michigan, as we look at tripling our charging infrastructure, you know, going from the current level stations to 1,000 stations by the year 2030, I guess what I'd like to hear from you guys is that, as you wrap up your EV programs quickly with a significant, it's going to be a significant challenge. As I said, we're going from 300 to 1,000 plus stations over the next few years. What implementation issues in regards to staffing, Buy America, availability of resources, as well as those resources needed to actually do the installation of those charging stations, are you anticipating to try to address when this infrastructure money becomes available? So I guess I'll open it up to Colorado, but everybody should. I want to hear from everyone on this because I think this is important.
Sure, Robert, happy to jump in. As a program manager at heart, I tend to think first about organizational capacity. There are lots of challenges, I think, with spending money at the scale that we're talking about, particularly because it's so much more than I think most of the states have experience managing, at least in this space. So I think without a doubt, staffing is going to be important to make sure that you've got the program managers that can develop and implement and manage the programs and the awards that are made. But I think it's not just about your program management staff. It's looking at the entire system. Do you have the procurement staff? Do you have the accounting folks? Do you have the operating folks that are there to help support the work? But then I also think about kind of the broad program management infrastructure. Are your systems and tools prepared to handle funding it at this scale? So do you have the procurement and contract systems in place? So for instance, in Colorado, if we're going to do an RFA, and any grant that we issue comes through a request for applications, it's our own team that does it. It's not our contracts or procurement staff. So we have to make sure we have the capacity to manage at this scale. And then I think about things like, do you have the application platform that can allow you to collect applications at scale in a manner that's efficient? Do you have the tools that you need to collect the kind of data to show that funds are being spent efficiently and that you're continuing to refine your programs as the market changes? And then last, I would just note, some sort of investment or program plan that ensures that you're spending that money in a way that maximizes the impact. We've heard about both corridors as well as a community. Well, every state needs both, but what that mix looks like is going to depend on what you have on the ground today and what your state looks like. So I think that planning aspect is really important.
The only thing I'll add to that from the DOT perspective is that I think DOTs may have traditional, more experience managing large sums of money on a tighter timeline. But what can be lacking at the DOT is a supportive culture for transportation electrification. And so having those conversations with folks in your agency who may not see this as a priority yet or who may not have experience with it, if you lay that groundwork, they will be much more collaborative when the time comes to move things quickly and efficiently.
Have you guys thought about the shortage of supply of charging stations? I mean, we're all going to go out there and we're going to try to corner the market on DC fast chargers because we need to build them out in our state. And the labor that's required to actually do the installation and the infrastructure that's required to be in place prior to the placement of these charging stations. Can you guys talk a little bit about your thought process and how you're going to deal with that? So I guess for us, and what we're thinking is that we need to begin to have conversations with EVgo, ChargePoint, with all the charging companies to look at the availability of chargers and what are their capacity in terms of providing the charging stations to states as the need arises. And then what labor force do they have and what labor force that is within our state, and how do we provide an equity opportunity for certain groups that have been out of this market to be able to enter into the market, to be able to get involved in the installation and repair of charging stations. That's something that we need to start thinking about, and maybe we can have future conversations on that.
Just to jump in there, yeah, I agree that that's a huge topic that we should be thinking for and planning for. And I think even before we get to the point of, supply of installers and all of that, I think at least from our perspective in Tennessee, Buy America is currently one of our biggest concerns. I mentioned the RFI that TVA released on hardware, network, and support services. We tried to use that RFI as a way to identify Buy America compliant vendors. To date, we haven't been able to find a single compliant vendor. And so, until we know that we have a charger that we can point to that's Buy America compliant, we won't be able to use any of these dollars. And so we won't even be able to sell anything. So to us, that's kind of our number one concern at the moment. And it was nice to hear Andrew Wishnia say that they are, they acknowledge that that's a topic that they need to address at the federal level, because I think if there's guidance at the federal level, it'll help streamline things for all the states that are needing to implement this.
Right. I guess that's an action that all the states could coalesce around. I've got another question. And it has to do with the EV planning. There's been a significant progress in states on EV infrastructure planning and rollout, and states are now preparing for the potential of spending billions of dollars on EV stations over the next 5 years. I want to get your initial reaction to the infrastructure package and the prospects of dramatically enhancing your EV programs. I guess I'd like to start with the folks at Washington State.
Well, yes, I can chime in on this one. We are just thrilled with the funding coming from the federal government. I think it's really going to help us get to the next level. One thing I really like about it is when we had the ARA funds 12 years ago, those had to be shovel-ready projects with a very tight timeline. So I'm actually pleased that we have 5 years to invest that funding. People talk about the equipment and the installation, but there's a lot of work that has to happen before that, with identifying the sites, getting the electric utility upgrades done. So I'm personally just very excited, but also I am a little concerned that there are all these cars coming out and people are going to start buying these cars, and they're going to be surprised that there aren't more chargers already out there. It can take 18 months from the time you start a project to the time it opens for the public. So I think the expectations might be really high that, federal government's putting all this funding out there. For Washington State, it means about $71 million in formula funds, which is a big chunk, but it's going to take a while to actually implement that. So I think Christian nailed it with, we really have to be staffed up and ready for this. And I think we can all see that at our staff levels. We just need to make sure our agencies build the capacity for this. Michael, do you have anything to add?
I would just add that, it's a lot of people act as if this money's coming, and I still feel like there's a lot of uncertainty. And so just like setting expectations accordingly with stakeholders. But if the ink dries on whatever legislation passes, I think for us, it's also, we're a significantly huge state. And as Tonya mentioned in our presentation, we are trying to eliminate the gap. And the problem with gaps is that they often reflect underlying resource constraints in applicants, be it small local governments or under-resourced businesses. And I think we can have all the money in the world, but if you can't resource entities to receive it and implement it, it's not going to do that great. And so Tonya and I and others are really trying to figure out how to really enable grassroots at the community level and support local governments so they can receive $70+ million from WashDOT, all the public transit money, DOE money. And so that's what I'm really focused on in particular, is just preparing communities and local governments to access this money.
Great. Now, I apologize that we're not going to be able to get to all the questions in the chat. We'll try to address that at a later time. We're at the end of our session, and I want to thank the panel for spending the afternoon with us and their time to present what their state is doing. And I want to turn it over to Cassie. Thank you all.
Thank you, Robert, and thank you to all of our